Before Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, he went somewhere. Not Bethany, not the tomb, not toward the crowd. Inside. And what happened in that interior space? The actual movement, the method, the door he walked through before power moved, that was removed from what you were taught. Not lost, removed. The words are still in your Bible. John 11:41, still there. Matthew 6:6, still there. But the practice that made the words alive, that's gone. And here's what I want you to sit with before we go any further. If Jesus was simply praying the way you were taught to pray, asking, requesting, pleading, then why did his prayers work? Why do yours feel like they're hitting a ceiling? You've been told it's a faith problem, a worthiness problem, a timing problem. What if it's a method problem? What if the thing that was removed wasn't a theological concept? It was a technique, something learnable, something that ordinary people, if they discovered it, would no longer need an institution to mediate their relationship with God. Let that land for a second, because that is exactly why it was taken out. Not destroyed, not argued away, just quietly moved into the hands of the few and left there, until most people forgot it had ever existed. This isn't for everyone watching. If you're here for comfort, this won't give you that. If you're here because you want your current theology affirmed, this will probably disturb it. But if you've sensed somewhere beneath all the ritual, the liturgy, the Sunday repetition, that the way Jesus moved through the world wasn't just belief, it was method, then you're exactly where you need to be. Let's start with what you were given. You were taught that prayer is talking to God, asking, requesting, confessing, thanking, pleading if things got desperate enough. And you were told if you prayed hard enough, believed strongly enough, asked sincerely enough, maybe God would answer. Maybe. But only if it was His will. Only if the timing was right. Only if your faith cleared some invisible threshold you could never quite locate. So you prayed. And sometimes things happened. And sometimes they didn't. And when they didn't, you were given 3 acceptable explanations. God said no. You didn't have enough faith. His plan was bigger than your understanding. Accept it. Surrender to it. Move on. And over time, prayer became something you performed, a monologue, a wish list, a ritual you executed because that's what good Christians do. You bowed your head, you folded your hands, you closed your eyes and spoke into the silence, hoping someone was listening. But here's what nobody told you. That is not what Jesus did. When Jesus prayed, He wasn't asking God to change His mind. He wasn't trying to convince the Father of anything. He wasn't hoping for a response. He was doing something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with words and everything to do with where He went before He spoke them. And the difference between what He did and what you were taught to do, that difference is why His prayers moved mountains, and yours feel like they're hitting a ceiling. Now, I want to show you something in the text, and I need you to watch it carefully, because this is where almost everyone stops paying attention. And this is where everything changes. Go back to the miracles. not to admire them, not to worship them. Observe them. Watch the pattern. When Jesus healed the paralytic, the text says he saw their faith, and then he spoke. But between seeing and speaking, something happened. Mark doesn't name it. It just says he looked at the man and then he said, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." When he fed the 5,000, he took the loaves and the fish and he looked up to heaven. That's what it says. He looked up. Then he blessed. Then it multiplied. When he walked on water, Matthew 14, he went up on the mountain alone to pray. Alone, in silence, before the impossible. When the woman with the issue of blood touched his garment, he didn't decide to heal her. He didn't pray for her healing. The power moved through him because he was already in a state where power could move. You see it? Every time, every single time, there's something happening before the visible event, an inward movement, a prior alignment, a door he walked through before any word was spoken or any miracle appeared. And then we get to Lazarus. John 11:41. Jesus stands at the entrance of the tomb, and he lifts his eyes and says, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me." Wait, stop there. He thanked the Father for already hearing him, before Lazarus came out, before the miracle happened, before there was a single visible piece of evidence that anything had changed. He spoke in the past tense. If prayer is asking God to do something, that makes no sense. You don't thank someone for doing someone before they've done it. You don't speak in past tense about a future event unless you're no longer standing in the future, unless you've gone somewhere else, entered a state where the separation between what is and what will be has collapsed. And that is exactly what Jesus did. He entered. The question is, entered where? And more importantly, if Jesus did this every single time before every act of power, why does no one talk about it? Why, when you ask a pastor how Jesus performed miracles, do they tell you it was because he was the Son of God, as if that explains anything, instead of showing you what he actually did? Because here's the uncomfortable answer. They don't know. The method was lost to them too. Matthew 6:6. You've heard it your whole life. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Your whole life, you've heard that as advice about privacy. Find a quiet place. Don't be showy. Pray where no one's watching. And that's not wrong, but it's not what he meant. The Greek word Jesus uses for room is tameion. It doesn't mean bedroom. It doesn't mean closet in the modern sense. It means inner chamber, treasury, a hidden place inside something. Jesus is giving you a location, and it's not external. He is saying, when you pray, go inward, into the part of you that exists beyond your thoughts, beyond your identity, beyond the noise of your mind and the pull of the outer world. Go into your inner room. And then, this is critical, he says, close the door. Not try to focus, not minimize distractions. Close the door. Seal it. Shut out the world of the senses. Shut out the mind's chatter. Shut out the version of yourself that's afraid, that's wanting, that's asking. Because the Father doesn't live out there. He lives in secret, in the inner room, in the place most people never go, because they don't even know it exists. And Jesus went there every single time before a miracle occurred. That's not speculation. That's pattern. The early church, the one that existed before councils, before creeds, before Rome took over, knew how to do what Jesus taught. They practiced it. They taught it to initiates. It was passed down quietly, carefully, in small communities where trust was everything. These weren't secrets kept out of arrogance. They were practices that required readiness, a certain quality of attention that couldn't be forced or faked. You couldn't teach someone how to enter the inner room if they hadn't first learned to be still, if they hadn't first developed the capacity to recognize the difference between thinking about God and actually encountering His presence. The teaching was gradual, protected, reserved for those who demonstrated they were ready. But when Christianity became the religion of an empire, something shifted. The institution needed order, structure, something that could be taught at scale to masses of people in a way that didn't depend on interior development. And inner instruction doesn't survive that. You cannot systematize silence. You cannot standardize the inner room. You cannot train priests to guide people into a place the priests themselves may never have entered. So the method, the interior practice, the actual lived instruction, the step-by-step process of entering the inner room and closing the door was gradually moved out of public teaching. Not destroyed, not erased, just withheld. The words were kept, the parables were kept, the commandments were kept, but the instructions, the how, that was moved into the hands of the few. Monks in desert cells, mystics in hidden communities, the occasional saint who stumbled into it through decades of solitary devotion. And over centuries, even they forgot. What remained were rituals, liturgies, prayers you could memorize, forms you could follow without ever once going inward. You could be a good Christian, attend church, take communion, recite the creeds, without ever once entering the inner room. And most people never did. Here is what Jesus understood that is almost completely absent from modern Christianity. Prayer isn't about persuading God. It's about coherence. Let me say that again, because this is the hinge point of everything. The kind of prayer Jesus practiced isn't about convincing God to do something. It's about entering a state of alignment where you and the source are no longer separate, where your will and the Father's will are the same, where there's no gap, no distance, no division, just union. And from that place, when you speak, you're not hoping reality will change. You're recognizing that it already has. That's why Jesus spoke in past tense at Lazarus' tomb. That's why he thanked the Father before the miracle appeared. Because from inside the inner room, from the place of alignment, the future and the present collapse into one. What you see with physical eyes hasn't caught up yet, but in the realm of cause, in the invisible, it's already done. John 14:10, Jesus says it plainly. The words that I say to you, I do not speak on my own authority, but the Father who dwells in me, He does His works. He's not claiming personal power. He's not taking credit. He's saying, I am not doing this. The Father is doing it through me. Not for Him, not to Him, through him. Meaning Jesus became the vessel, the doorway, the place where heaven and earth met. And he did that by entering the inner room and closing the door to everything that wasn't God. If you try to speak from your personality, from your ego, from your separated mind, from the place of want and fear, nothing happens. Because you're still outside the door, and the outer world doesn't respond to separation. It responds to Source. This is why he spent 40 days in the wilderness before his ministry began. This is why he went to the mountain to pray before choosing the 12. This is why he withdrew to solitary places again and again, even when the crowds were pressing in, even when the need was urgent, even when people were desperate. He wasn't recharging. He wasn't resting. He was realigning. He was going back into the inner room, closing the door, and remembering who he was beyond the human personality. And every time he did, he came back with power. Now, I know the question forming in you right now. Okay, how? What's the technique? What are the steps? And I'm going to give you something, but not everything. Not because I'm withholding out of strategy, not because I'm building toward a product, but because if I gave you the full method right now, all of it, you'd do exactly what the modern mind does with every deep thing it encounters. You'd consume it, file it, move on. The inner room doesn't open for people who consume it. It opens for people who stay at the threshold. So here's what I'll give you. Not the whole thing. The entry point. Sit. Be still. Close your eyes. And instead of starting to pray, just breathe. And as you do, begin to feel for the place behind your thoughts. The stillness that's always there. The silence underneath the noise. It's subtle. You won't hear a voice. You won't see a vision. But if you stay there, if you resist the urge to start talking, start asking, start performing prayer, you'll begin to feel it. A presence. Not external, not separate. Closer than your own breath. Closer than your own heartbeat. That's the edge of the inner room. When you feel it, don't rush forward. Don't try to make something happen. Just be there. You might sit for 5 minutes and feel nothing. You might sit for 10 and think you're doing it wrong. You're not. You're learning to be still, to close the door, to stop talking long enough to hear. You're learning what it feels like to not be the voice in your head, even for a moment. You're learning to rest in the presence that has been there the entire time, waiting for you to notice. That's the foundation. Without this, nothing else works. You can memorize every scripture in the canon. You can fast for 40 days. You can serve and worship and lead. But if you never learn to enter the inner room, if you never learn to close the door and be still, you'll always be praying from the outside. And the outside has no power. Here's what I'm not telling you yet. There's a second layer, a deeper instruction. Something Jesus did after the stillness, after the alignment, after he entered the inner room and closed the door. Not a word, not a request. A movement of awareness that turned alignment into authority. A shift in identity that allowed him to speak as the Father, not just to the Father. And once you see it, you'll understand why it was never taught publicly. Because it's not something you can perform. It's something you become. But here's what you need to hear right now, before we get there. If you've made it to this point in the video, you're one of the ones who senses it. You felt the gap, the disconnect, the way your prayers seem to echo in empty space, the quiet suspicion that something essential was taken out, not by accident, but by design. And now you know why. You were taught the words, but not the method. You were given the map, but no one showed you how to walk. And that is not your fault. But it is your responsibility. Because you cannot unknow this now. You cannot go back to folding your hands and hoping someone is listening. Not after seeing what Jesus actually did. Not after seeing the pattern. Not after standing at the edge of the inner room and knowing it's real. Most people will watch this and move on. They want miracles. They want results. They want proof. But they don't want to sit in silence. They don't want to let go of control. They don't want to stop talking long enough to hear. That's fine. That's their path. But if you're different, if you're one of the few who's willing to stay at the threshold, even when nothing dramatic happens at first, then you're ready for what comes next. Because there's more. There's a second layer to this, a deeper instruction. Something Jesus did after the stillness that turned prayer into power. Something that cannot be explained, only experienced. And in the next video, I'm going to show you what it was. But I'm only going to show it to those who've already begun, to those who've already sat in the silence, who've already felt for the edge of the inner room, who've already tasted what it's like to stop being the voice in their head, even for a moment. Because the second part doesn't work without the first. You were right that there was more. You were right that something was missing. You were right that the way Jesus moved through the world wasn't just belief. It was method. And the door has been there the whole time. You just weren't told where to look. What you've touched in this video was never meant to end here. There are deeper writings, quiet reflections, and simple practices that help you return to the inner room again and again. We call them the sacred scrolls. Each one carries a fragment of the original way. Not sermons, not arguments. Guidance into stillness, alignment, and remembrance. They're not written to persuade anyone. They're offered only for those who have felt the silence open and who know that words alone are no longer enough. You'll find the sacred scrolls in the description and the pinned comment. And if this path has made you feel like you no longer belong fully in the old structures, you're not alone. There's a quiet gathering place where those learning to pray inwardly can walk together. Not to debate, not to perform faith, to remember it. If something in you recognizes that, the doorway is waiting in the description. There's no rush. Stillness cannot be forced. Truth reveals itself when you're ready. Those who are meant to find this always do. Now go inward, close the door, and wait. The Father who sees in secret is already there. He's been there the whole time, waiting for you to remember.